tree. Gandalf! Gandalf!
Yes, the white tree of Gondor, the tree of the king. Lord Denethor, however, is not the king. He is a steward only, a caretaker of the throne.
I do not mention Frodo. The ring. In fact, it's better if you don't speak at all, Pelican too.
There's a tension when it comes to the kingdoms of man and Lord of the Rings that doesn't really appear with the other races. You have the elves off in their isolated homes, of Mithlond and Lothlorien and Mirkwood, and they kind of are protected by their own magic and their own powers and just have their own game going on from there. They're leaving Middle-earth because this is not their fight anymore. This is not their land. The dwarves themselves are more or less, it's interesting for especially the Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, they're really just off doing their own thing. They're completely isolated from everyone else. They don't really care what seems to be going on, particularly in the south. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of dwarves in the south, which is interesting. They seem to be primarily focused on the north and the Iron Hills and the Blue Mountains, and of course the Lonely Mountain from The Hobbit that we saw. And so for the Kings of Man, what we have is there's this tension regarding whether or not they will give in to the influence of Sauron or stand up and fight against evil when it comes up. And this is what makes their characters so interesting. Boromir, I did a video on this earlier. Boromir is such a good character because he has this constant tension, because he is, the chosen champion of Gondor, and yet he completely fails. And so what we get into in this point is, what does it take for a leader of man to stand up against Sauron's power? And we have Aragorn as one example, but he's like half elf and kind of a little bit superhuman. So right now what we're going to be focusing on is the two kingdoms of man, particularly Rohan and Gondor. The first is Théoden of Rohan and the other is Denethor of Gondor. And for today, we're going to be talking about, there's a literary term called Chiasmus or Chiasmos. I'm not quite sure how it's supposed to be pronounced from there, but it's a storytelling technique where you have one character who starts up at the top, and over the course of the plot and story, they fall to their demise. Usually it's a stationary fall. They start off powerful and they end up weak. And then there's a contrasting character who starts at the bottom and rises to the top. They start off weak and then they move to be powerful. It's the classic, dynamic that we love to see, where you have the bully who's at the top of their game and the young buck who's trying to, make their way and not get bullied. And they end up clashing. And at the end of the story, the young guy managed to reaches the top of the food chain, if you will, managed to stand for his own, and the bully falls down from here. You have one character who begins as successful and powerful and with a flaw, and you see this demise. And what it's done is you have this complete contrast. You can see what made one character successful and what made the other not. It gives you a clear way to judge both the trials and how they deal with all these situations. So taking a look at Théoden and Denethor, we get to see how they deal with all these different situations, how they deal with the loss of their sons, Boromir and Theodred, how Théoden responds to the impending doom at Helm's Deep, and Denethor at Minas Tirith. When all hope is seemingly lost, what do they do in the face of death?
Théoden, son of Thengel. Too long you've sat in the shadows. I release you from the spell.
You have no power here, Gandalf the Grey.
Let's take a look at Théoden. We see throughout the story of the Lord of the Rings, we see the full arc of his character, and we're first introduced to him when he's barely alive. He's a weak shell of a man turned old and gray by Wormtongue and Saruman, and he allows bandits and orcs to run free across his land, and Saruman continues to increase his own power and his own army. His own son, Theodred, is murdered, and he simply rots away. There's really no reaction. You can see he's a lifeless shell of a man. Éowyn, his niece, is living in fear under the creepy eyes of Wormtongue, who has his own designs to take her for himself, where she has no choice, and she's sticking around hoping and praying that her uncle, Théoden, will wake up from this so he can return to being the man he once was. Edoras itself is, it's a nightmare nation that's falling apart from here. Gandalf arrives, heals him, and finally returns the king to his senses, only for Rohan to immediately be on the brink of utter destruction. Gandalf arrives right at the nick of time, and Sauron's plan plan, he has this twofold plan for Isengard to march on Edoras and destroy Rohan, and then Mordor itself will be marching on Gondor, and that will be it for Middle-earth from there. Once those two nations fall, those are the last two nations of any standing with any sort of army that can really hope to stand up against Mordor, and it's completely over if they fall. And so what Théoden does is he gathers what little troops he has in the time to go to Helm's Deep and keep Rohan itself alive and save his people. And now let's take a look at the introductions. We saw how Théoden was introduced. Let's see how Denethor is introduced.
You think you are wise, Mithrandir. Yet for all your subtleties, you have not wisdom. Do you think the eyes of the White Tar are blind? I have seen more than you know. With your left hand, you would use me as a shield against Mordor, and with your right, you would seek to supplant me. I know who rides with Theoden of Rohan. Oh yes, word has reached my ears of this Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and I tell you now, I will not bow to this ranger from the north.
When we meet Denethor, he's the proud ruler of Gondor. He's not the king, rather a steward, but the true kings of Gondor have been gone for years. He's effectively the king of the last great nation. Again, Rohan was supposed to be one of the other great nations of men, the great nation of the horse lords, but you can see the state that they had fallen into before Gandalf arrived. And so when they're arriving to Minas Tirith and Gandalf is going with Pippin, he spends a lot of time coaching Pippin on what to say, what not to say, how to articulate this message, because of course Denethor knows that his beloved son, his favorite son Boromir, has died and was wrapped up in something to do with the ring and the fellowship and the these hobbits, and Pippin is a hobbit who's being delivered under the guise under the protection of Gondor. And so what are they going to do? And so this cautiousness from Gandalf is completely different, you can see, from how he reacts to Théoden. And Théoden, he barges in, completely in control of the situation, heals the king, and the king just lockstep goes, yes, Gandalf, you're right, and then they jump off to go to the next thing. With Denethor, he has to take a completely different stand, because Denethor is still the ruler. He's still the very powerful ruler the people listen to him. He is effectively the king. He's acting as the king. He has his own designs, his own political intrigues. He's sending Boromir to Rivendell. He's caught up in his own goals to try and get the ring to Gondor. He has his own plans. He sees Elrond as an equal. Elrond is not somebody who's wiser than him that he needs to listen to. Elrond is just another rival king, if you will, from him. He has his own game that's going to play because he's trying to save his people. It's the same thing along with Boromir. They're trying to save their people because their people are on the front lines dying under the shadow of Mordor. And so they have to continue to fight, and they have to use everything that could be available of them, because the rest of Middle-earth is more or less just living off their blood of their sacrifice from here. And this is a complete contrast from Théoden, who's completely falling apart. Rohan is completely leaderless. Everybody's kind of doing whatever they want, and it's just a complete mess. But Denethor is in control. They are falling and they're under siege, but Denethor is very much in control. However, he doesn't really see that there's much hope. And you can really see Théoden, despite the fact that he's essentially been asleep, his son is dead, all of this stuff is going on, he immediately jumps into action. For Théoden, for Denethor, think of what he could have been doing all this time. But instead, what does he do? He goads Faramir off into this suicide mission. Osgiliath dies, and all he can do is bemoan the death of his son, which is tragic. However, lots of people of sons are going to die if you don't do something, because you are the king. And this is what it matters to see what a true leader and what a true king will do when you are facing death.
Théoden's betrayed me.
Abandon your post! Flee! Flee for your lives! Prepare for battle!
And this whole build-up and scene is one where Denethor has completely fallen. Faramir's come back from this suicide mission, not surprisingly gravely wounded. Honestly, it's surprising that it came back at all. And Denethor has just completely lost it at this point. There's nowhere to run. Where are people going to even run? They're completely surrounded by an army. The orcs they're probably not going to take any slaves. Everyone is toast. How are these people going to flee? The elderly, the children, what are people going to do? And what does any sane leader do? They immediately try and burn the last living son alive from here. And so this is Denethor's fall. You know, he's believing that death would be a mercy, that the only thing left to do is to take what little control you have and exercise it. He only has control over his own death and the death of his son, and he's going to put both of them out of their misery with one of the most painful deaths possible, I think. But again, this just goes to his complete madness, that he's completely fallen to Sauron's influence. You know, he's completely at the mercy of him. He's not like Théoden from here. And let's take a look. There's a section of the books that I wanted to read out from here. Pride and despair, he cried. Didst thou think that the eyes of the White Tower were blind? Nay, I have seen more than thou knowest, grey fool. For thy hope is but ignorance. Go then and labor in healing. Go forth and fight. Vanity, for a little space you may triumph on the field, for a day. But against the power that now arises, there is no victory. To this city only the first finger of its hand has yet been stretched. All the east is moving, and even now the wind of thy hope cheats thee and wafts up Anduin, a fleet with black sails. The west has failed. It is time for all to depart who would not be slaves. And so you can see at this point, Denethor is completely given up. While there might be one single chance, he's not. It's just ultimately complete. He's completely given up hope. And you can see now what someone who completely gives up hope, with the actions of someone like that, what they would do in this situation.
Set a fire in our flesh.
It's interesting to see, because as I get older, the characters I appreciate more and more have changed dramatically. I used to go for the most powerful characters and the characters who have it all together, because they're the most exciting. You know, if you align with Gandalf, you'll generally never be wrong. You know, if you think Legolas is superhuman amazing, you're going to be right, because that's basically what he does. If Aragorn is awesome, you're going to be right from there. And so by contrast, you know, Boromir is nothing more than a weak, short-sighted man of little to moderate talent from there. But we don't ever get to see Boromir at the height of his glory, when he's beating back the armies of Gondor and rallying the last kingdom, the last functioning kingdom of man against evil. We don't get to see that. All we get to see is his fall from here. And same thing with Denethor. But at the same point, you also can easily overlook Théoden as a king himself. You know, he's a regular king. He's an old man. He's not exactly, you know, Éomer. He's not an Aragorn. He's not like an elf. He can't live forever. And so as I get older, I really appreciate the more grounded characters, the more realistic characters, the characters who are more like a regular people. You know, you really appreciate them and the struggles they go through, because Théoden goes through everything. He wakes up from this sight realizing he's let his kingdom fall apart. His son has died. His niece has been living in terror of being, you know, accosted and abused by this creepy weirdo. And his nation is on the brink of, you know, genocide or complete destruction. And he jumps into action. And this is what makes me love Théoden so much. He's such a good character, you know. And we'll take a look at this next scene, as just the mournful, the breadth of emotion that this character goes through when he realizes that his son is dead. And he's basically just he had been, you know, completely absent from all of it. It's just, he fits the role of what a king should be so well, where he has all of these emotions. He's not afraid to show it. And what this does is, think of this, on one end we have his lowest point, and just keep this in mind as we move towards his moment and on Pelennor Fields, when he comes to the rise and the aid of Gondor. But let's take a look at the scene.
No parents should have to bury their child.
And you can see it's just even more contrasted with how Denethor reacts versus with Théoden. You know, Théoden mourns. No one is under any illusion that he does not love his son, that he completely loves. He lived for his son. Denethor mourns Boromir and then would rather burn and let his entire legacy die with him. He would rather see the entire world collapse because he's given up hope. Who cares about everyone else's sons or anything like that? And what this scene for Théoden does is it completely grounds him. Théoden, Denethor is introduced, compared. Think of how it's compared the two. Denethor is at the top. He's in control of his nation. He has his network of spies. He has all these schemes going on, everything from here. The Rohan is completely falling apart. The king is weak. Everything. He's unable to protect his son, he banishes his nephew. His niece is, basically ready to be preyed upon by this creepy guy. And what this does is you see from going from the bottom to the top, the triumph of his character. And so what happens is, the beacons are lit and Gondor calls for aid and the Rohan will answer. They're getting ready to ride out. And in the books, this section is actually fairly lengthier than you realize. And it's this great moment where you're seeing this slow buildup where it's a lot more the logistical side of the building an army. It's a lot of supplies. It's a lot of going to point A to B to C to D to D to F to G and picking up troops, trying to get more people, getting more horses, getting more spears, getting all this stuff. And it's a slow buildup. And it's told from the point of view of Merry, who's sneaking along with the Rohirrim because, of course, Théoden rightly tells him, you're small, your pony's tiny, you can't keep up. You're just going to be a liability at this point, which is absolutely correct. And he teams up with this fellow named Durnhelm, who will come up later. And there's this, it's almost like a really slow section. Lord of the Rings, the books, always gets this reputation for being kind of slow. It's not that slow, but I think most people just remember it being slow because it's kind of this buildup, though. But this is what you want. You want the quiet before the storm. You want this contrast so you can have this triumphant moment because basically they're riding nonstop from Edoras down to Minas Tirith to come to the aid and save mankind from here. And so they have this thing that they're traveling along in this quiet buildup because here's the thing, they don't know what's coming for them. They don't know what they're going to run into. Because even if the army of Edoras, they send out scouts ahead of time and do that whole thing, the point of view is from Merry and Durnhelm, which they don't know. They're not in the, the who's who of knowing what's going on. Éomer and Théoden are taking care of all of that from here. And so what you see is this contrast for what are you going to do? You're going to face evil no matter what. They don't know even if they're going to survive or not. And compare this moment when Théoden rides up and sees the armies, compare it with Denethor looking out upon his kingdom and seeing the armies of Mordor, completely just despairing and giving up everything of what he, giving up all hope. Théoden jumps into action and has this amazing speech. It's one of my favorite of the entire series. It's the Red Day speech. And let's take a look at it. Because again, Gandalf has this moment saying that death is not the end. Death is merely a part. And the question is if you were in this army looking at this horde of orcs before you, do you believe that? Is death the end? Is that the worst thing that can happen to you? Is that the end of your story?
Form ranks, you maggots! Form ranks! Pikes in front! Archers behind! Hey, man! Take your erect down the left flank! Gamling, follow the king's banner down the center. Grimmauld, take your company right after you pass the wall. Forth, and fear no darkness! Arise! Arise, riders of Theoden! Spears shall be shaken! Shields shall be splintered! A sword day! A red day! And the sun rises! Rise now! Rise now! Rise! Rise to ruin and the world's ending! Death!
Imagine if Denethor hadn't sent Faramir on a suicide mission. What could he have done? There's always this great, I love theory crafting in Lord of the Rings about the what ifs of this and that and what else could have happened. In Warcraft 3, there was this little game mode called Lord of the Rings, I think the Ring Wars or something like that. And you could play it out. You could see what happened if Gondor retook Isengard. What would happen if, Gondor took, Minas Morgul, from here you have all these different options. What if, Mines of Moria were cleaned out and the dwarves were able to retake it? You have all these different things. What if Faramir didn't get sent on basically a suicide mission? What if Faramir had been the one to sent to Rivendell and Boromir had stayed, what would that have looked like? How would that have changed it? What if Faramir hadn't tried to retake Osgiliath? What if Faramir and his rangers were there in Minas Tirith, and when the Nazgul are constantly attacking, they can like shoot them down or something? You know, the despair of Denethor is fully complete, and there seems to be good cause. Again, there is little hope, but there's not no hope, but there's little hope. And the brainwashing is completely affecting him, though, because he doesn't even really seem to try. He doesn't even try to figure out, because even the Corsairs coming up, you know, the black ships of Umbar coming up the river, it's actually just Aragorn, you know, Aragorn with the army of the dead from here. And you can see the difference in how we look back on Theoden's legacy versus Denethor, you know, the legacy of man, you know, Isildur's curse, you know, from there, where it's like in the pivotal moment when the kings of man have the ability to try and set the stage right, how to fight back evil, they fail. And so what we have is, on one hand, we have Denethor's failure, and we have this rising challenge of Théoden, who's riding forth. Because again, Rohan's following Théoden. They're not following Gandalf. They're not following Aragorn. You know, Aragorn's not the king of Rohan. He's the true king of Gondor. They answer to Théoden, their rightful king, and he's riding forth to basically likely a suicide mission from there for the last chance of hope from here. He rides south to go defend, realizing that Edoras is completely defenseless. Fingers crossed nothing happens from there. He's not a man afraid of death. This is a red day, for death, that chant from here, the smallest hope to save Middle Earth, because it's worth it, even for that smallest hope, because remember, his son is dead, and despite everything, he's willing to take the smallest hope to save his people and his kingdom. He's going to take it, because he knows there is a tomorrow worth dying for, a tomorrow that his son will never see, but someone else might. And hear the words spoken about Théoden when his body is returned home to his people back in Edoras from his minstrel. His head minstrel says this. Out of doubt, out of dark, to the day's rising he rode, singing in the sun, sword unsheathing, hope he rekindled, and in hope ended. Over death, over dread, over doom lifted, out of loss of life, unto long glory. This is something that Lord of the Rings does so well that I really appreciate. Is all the side characters are fully fleshed out, and they're amazing characters themselves. You know, we could have a story about young Théoden fighting off, you know, doing whatever, and it would work. Young Denethor, you know, in the political intrigues against Gondor. We could see these. You could see whole movies or series or books or anything about these characters that are just side characters, effectively, in the Lord of the Rings, and because that's just how high quality this story is from there. So. That's all I've got for today. I hope you guys enjoy this one, and I'll see you in the next. This is Fiction Applied, and I'm Jeff Cassidy. I'll see you in the next.